D.C. Schindler, thank you very much for joining me again. This is actually our third podcast, a
Wow.
trilogy,
Yeah. Yeah.
I believe.
That's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
good number. Yes.
yeah. Um, and yeah, the impetus for this conversation, we're discussing is Plato's critique of images in the Republic. As I was saying, I was teaching a course last semester on the undergraduates on Plato's Republic, and something that kept coming up was the critique of images. And you're asking a lot of questions about it, like why is he critiquing images? Why is he so opposed to the poets? Even Book 10, and he's creating images, but he's not happy with the images, and then how this relates to the internet and our imagistic society is I thought a great topic to pick your brain on and see what you think.
Sure.
So maybe
Yeah.
if you could introduce like his critique of images and what your take on it to start
Yeah.
off might be
So, I
good.
mean, he's notorious for the famous ancient quarrel with the poets. And in this ideal city in the Republic, he kicks them out famously, so notoriously again. Um, and people have often read this as a kind of a moralistic rejection of art and artists and poets and so forth. And I think that, you know, they condemn Plato for that. And then at the same time, they with a certain snicker, point to the fact that he himself is obviously a consummate artist, and the Republic as a text is a great, poem in a way. It's a work of art. It's an artistic creation, an artifact. So he seems to be contradicting himself and so forth. And I think the issue is it's far more complex and interesting than those sort of dismissive critiques tend to be. It seems to me, first of all, that Plato was in fact concerned about the role that poetry in particular had in his culture. In the beginning of the Allegory of the Cave, he actually presents it as an image of education. And so it's interesting. What in the world does this have to do with education? I think it's helpful to realize that in ancient Greece, as one classicist said, Homer was the educator of the Greeks. That poetry was one of the principal means by which the citizens were educated. They were taught about the world, the nature of reality, and so forth, and also taught virtue. And obviously, a reason for that would be the fact that images can speak to us in ways that are that have an effect on us. They impact us. They form our imagination. They dispose us in certain ways. They don't just teach us information, but they teach us to love and hate different things. They really move us. And so Plato was aware of that, and his concern wasn't so much with that fact as it is that was done in a way that was unaware, was unconscious of the effect, and without much discrimination, without much attention to in a more profound way what was being communicated. So it seems to me what he's doing in the Republic is not so much rejecting that practice as retrieving it within, you might say, a purified or a kind of a re-envisioned program that actually is attentive to the fundamental questions about the nature of truth, the nature of the good. And so it's sort of reoriented in a positive direction. And that gives the imagery, the philosopher a certain freedom with respect to the images. I mean, there would be a million things. I don't, I could go on for 45 minutes.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great, and yeah, no, I don't want to just send you out to see you with, because it is so central to all of his thought as well. But I really, that point of like, that he's almost trying to overcome Homer, even though he loves Homer.
Yeah.
He's trying to like almost put Socrates in the place of Achilles or Odysseus and have the philosopher king as the new hero.
Yeah.
Versus the older kind of warrior king ideal. And
That's
obviously
right.
the philosopher king loves the truth, loves the whole of the truth. And so, there's a kind of redemption of images there. I mean,
Right.
I don't know. Is that landing? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the redemption of images is exactly a nice way to put it. He loved, I mean, there's evidence that he had a deep attraction to Homer. In fact, he also, the legend is that he had thought of himself as a playwright, that was sort of the path. That and statesmanship were kind of a path that he was originally going to follow before he met Socrates. But I think it's really helpful to see it's not a rejection of, an assumption of poetry in service of the truth. And the philosopher king doesn't destroy the cave. He enters back into it. He goes back down into it, into the realm of images. But the point is, he wants to do it in a liberating mode. And so what is it that liberates us from images? It's not that we remove them necessarily, but that we enter into genuine contact with the reality of which they are images. And that allows us, he says this about words, words, writing is meant to be, a reminder for those who know, rather than a substitute. You can memorize words and not really understand something, but if you understand it, the words are actually bring it actively to mind in a really helpful way. And I think that's what images are meant to be for Plato, is having glimpsed, having turned one's soul towards the good and the true. We can celebrate in a genuinely free and more playful spirit what is contained in the images, because we're not trapped by them, you might say.
Yes. And is there kind of a reaction to the sophists there as well, in that they use images to manipulate people? I know you talked about in the book appearances as being manipulative in a way, that they're, you can use these kind of affective images in order to drive people certain ways and shape their salience. And it's almost like the good artist, in a sense, like the philosopher king, are using those images to have an affecting relationship towards the good.
Yeah.
But then other people can use it to have an affecting relationship towards lower goods, or towards their own benefit,
towards ultimately their own
or themselves.
right, self-interest. Yeah, one of the things I find really helpful with the comparison. So the sophists were teachers, but of course they sold their courses, as opposed to Socrates, who taught for free. And interestingly, Socrates wouldn't describe himself as a teacher. He said, in the sense of someone who puts knowledge into the soul, sort of you think of it as transmitting information. Instead, he uses the image of the maiutes in Greek, the midwife. And that's not somebody who gives you the truth, but who actually facilitates the relationship with the truth. The midwife does not impregnate the woman, but helps the woman give birth to the child. And Socrates wants to help the soul give birth to insight that, rather than provide it, but mediate it, allow it to come forth. And what's interesting there is what he's doing is he's mediating an immediate relationship. He becomes sort of an instrument by which you, as the student, achieve a direct insight into truth. And in the Republic there, it's interesting. He says, the teaching is not putting information into the soul, but turning it around to face the truth. And that relationship to the truth is one that's immediate, directly from the soul's own immediate relation.
Yes,
So
I think he uses
the
that
relationship
extended metaphor, doesn't he, as well, of like coupling of like an intercourse and of giving birth as knowledge, essentially, like carnal, almost that metaphor of like to know in a biblical sense of like a carnal knowledge, but that actually coming to reality involves this coupling to reality. It's not just like taking in, passive propositions or something like that.
Yeah,
It's a very
no,
different
that's right.
proposal.
It's an intimacy, an intercourse, and that's the word that he uses between the soul and being, and knowledge is produced, is generated. So the midwife, allows this relationship to happen, but isn't the governor of it, or isn't the manipulator of it. It's interesting if you were to look at the details of the allegory of the cave, it seems to me the sophists would be the ones who are behind the wall, who are fabricating the images, and moving them, that then project their shadows on the wall that the prisoners are sort of forced to see. It's those people. He doesn't say much about them in the allegory, but they are people there, and it seems to me those are the sophists, and they're the ones who, in a way, produce the images, that are taken
It
to
might
be.
help to pause on the cave for a second, because it
Yeah.
does. I guess the proposal I'm making with the internet thing is like, have we built a kind of digital cave in a sense that we have, like, for me, I suppose the companies that are behind it a lot are
Yeah.
the sophists, in that they're manipulating what people are seeing. And even just by the structure of the platform, like it incentivizes certain things and disincentivizes others. And then also you have the problem of just you're creating representations anyway, which Plato would probably freak out about. But, I wonder, yeah, are we in a kind of digital cave? And then I wonder, could we get to, is there a way to, get that journey out of the cave in it?
Well, I mean, it's funny. When I was a graduate student, and studied the Republic with Eric Pearl, who's, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but
Yeah, I've read
he
some of
was
his
a real
work.
mentor to me in graduate school. I recall him saying once, so that, this would have been whatever 25 years ago, that he never understood how anybody could teach the Republic before the invention of television. And he was talking about television, and I think the smartphone is an absolute, this is one of the things you realize, that what Plato was saying there is just getting truer and truer every year. And the point is, I mean, one had to make this kind of fantastical, imaginative leap to understand what he was talking about, say in the Middle Ages. But has become so real for us. So, um, this theme that you mentioned, the internet, and I think the smartphone really in particular, people are regularly now and increasingly observing that people have less and less an unmediated experience of reality. I mean, almost everything that we connect with, especially intellectually, somehow is mediated through the screen, or I like to call it a portal, because it's actually a two-way. It's a two-way
Yeah.
door. It's a um um and that a, quite commonly, I mean, in a way that's just frightening, actually. This is the case from 2 years old and up. I mean, maybe even earlier. I see some of the smallest children in the grocery store who are in the grocery cart with the screen on, and you just think about this observation, and always have some experience of this, but I think it would be especially the case for young people where, I grew up in a time before all this existed. So, I mean, I'm, that's already something. But these days it's all we have. People recognize that we start to measure our experiences and our realities by the standard of the screen.
Yeah.
Our relationships are measured by movie relations, or our things that we experience, and our, even like our sense of our own body, we can't interpret except in relation to the images we see on the screen and so forth. So increasingly these become the standard by which reality is measured, and that is, in a nutshell, heart of the problem for Plato.
And it's such a reversal as well, because like even you're talking about like unmediated experience, like not on a smartphone or something, but we're still then in the world of objects, which Plato is like, that's like not the, that's
right.
not even,
No, that's right.
that's not the actual one, but we're actually getting the opposite direction, like into a kind of simulacrum. And it reminds, obviously the Matrix is a kind of updated version of the cave, but also because John Vervaeke talks about that two worlds mythology, this idea that I don't really think Plato has a two worlds mythology. I think there's a reality, and then, but there is the more illusory world of the cave, the world of appearances, is becoming the normal world for people now with the digital.
That's right.
And I think a lot of the externalities we see for young people and the mental health crisis and a lot of this stuff is because they're living in a simulation. So
it's interesting, and it's often described as a crisis of isolation and loneliness. And I mean, think of the irony. These things are all called social media, and it's precisely this that's creating this kind of crisis of isolation. And that is that Plato presents the people in the cave as even they hear their own voice reflected off the back screen. And then they encounter the people sitting next to them only in terms of their own voices and images reflect off the screen. So there's actually no direct.
There's no like two-way communication between them.
Right.
Actually.
Right. They don't even know it's there. In the image.
And I thought it was very interesting that even the game they play of the guessing of the shadows, it's very much like the kind of predictive natural science game in a sense of like efficient causes that you can measure and predict, and that qualifies as knowledge, whereas Plato's version of knowledge is a very different.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. That's a really good point. Yeah, for Plato, it's like depth of insight, and in this, there's no depth; it's all surfaces. So it's just predictability, and you're right. That's interesting. Kind of a positivism, an empirical positivism.
And maybe it's the result of empirical positivism in a sense of that's what truth is in that paradigm. I have kind of thought that at times it's like if you reduce, if sense experience is just passive access to reality, then that is the truth. I mean, what we talked about last time, the correspondence theory, just like, truth is just the cat is on the mat. You say the cat is on the mat, that's truth. Whereas the whole Platonic version of truth is totally, that would be being in the cave, which is, the lowest level of reality.
Yeah, and that's the we can't even imagine what it would mean to go further, because we're stuck with this. Just you've got a representation and it either corresponds to a state of affairs or it doesn't. Yeah, rather than this depth of insight that occurs only when you ask the question, "What is something?" That sort of change. But I'd like to, you brought something up, and I don't want to lose it because it's a really intriguing point that I've wondered about too, and might bring out a certain dimension beyond Plato's allegory that Plato wouldn't be content, obviously, with going out into the natural world, but wants to see even the natural world as an image, and our cave has become so powerful, mighty, and comprehensive. For us even to get out into the world of nature is just a massive achievement itself. And it seems to me that what's interesting, and I guess we can look at Plato's allegory here, that would correspond to somebody who's turned around and has come to see that the projections on the cave wall are actually emanating from these figurines that are being manipulated here. But you notice, if you think about it, once you've made that turn, you already see the light at the end of the tunnel, and the sunlight already in the distance. The principle, you could still say something like entering into the natural world and sort of recognizing its priority over the image world is a kind of would lead inevitably, if you were faithful to it, to an insight into the source of truth.
Yes, and there's something there with that, like, this is a bit of maybe a crazy suggestion, but that the attentional manipulation that happens in the digital world, if you get so manipulated by that, if you can go beyond it, in a sense, you would see how your previous reality was a kind of construction of these things. So you would get an insight, in a sense, to how your attention can be warped, which might help you to intuit that there's actually things beyond your own current Umwelt or perceptual world.
Well, I mean, in fact, more than just might help you. I think it's implied already in that. I mean, because you wouldn't be able to see what manipulation would mean unless you have already sort of present some sense of a reality that you're deviating from. So because if there's nothing but manipulation, then manipulation is no different. I mean, there's no standard by which to measure it. It's not really manipulation then.
That's so interesting. That's such a problem in the social media literature a lot of the time, because like the crime I think that they're committing is like setting up almost like a culture, like a culture that fosters acrasia, that fosters like people behaving in self-destructive ways, like a foolish culture in a sense. But you have to have a notion of a wise culture to evaluate that in a sense. So like if they're setting up just this Hollywood movie kind of nonsense thing for children, it's like, yeah, it's like they can do that, but you have to have an idea of a functioning culture in order to evaluate that already.
No, you're right. And, this leads to so many interesting questions. There's people that want to critique that culture, the, manipulative culture of images and so forth. You can't really do that unless you're standing on solid ground somehow. So as you say, there's got to be, this idea of, for instance, this is something that was brought home to me regarding the Me Too movement, and this idea that, obviously the shining a light on this, widespread practice of harassment and exploitation and so forth. All that is true, but it's interesting. The problem is that people take consent to be the solution to the problem. That, if it's a matter of consent, then somehow, but the more people thought about it, the more they realize, well, wait a minute, you might be giving your consent, but the person is a figure of power, and so even your consent has been manipulated and so forth. And it becomes clear that there's no way to finally distinguish between manipulation and freedom unless you refer to something objectively true. And that's something that that's missed often from these things. But it seems to me that that's a fundamentally Platonic insight that unless truth is there, there's no such thing as freedom. There's no liberation from manipulation unless you're talking about truth and not just consent or, whatever sort of willingness.
Yeah. And that truth, I mean, is like, it doesn't really exist, I think, in this kind of secular landscape. Like they don't have an account, like scientific materialism can't provide that. Like it doesn't, and so we're kind of locked in then into this manipulative space. I think that's why social media's gotten away with what they're doing in a sense, because there isn't enough people on the outside of it to actually be like, yeah, this is, incredibly manipulative, because we've lost that reality.
No, you're absolutely right. And it's amazing then at the end, it's sort of, we don't want them to manipulate. We want to be the ones manipulating. It's just sort of a, it's not a question of whether there's manipulation. It's just a dispute over who gets to do the manipulating, but none of that is real freedom. And you're right. I mean, there's no way out of this without some moment of genuine transcendence where the light of the good enters. And this is something that was the birth of that book, Plato's Critique of Pure Reason. And I've been coming back to recently, with some work I've been doing on the nature of authority, that there's something about the bearing witness that you need to have an individual, some concrete human being who bears witness to a higher order that actually lets the light in. And I don't know of any real way out other than.
And it's kind of what Plato's doing in the Republic in a sense, isn't it? Like, because that's why the Republic just seems so relevant to me with the social media stuff, because he's setting up a society, in a sense, a city in speech and this kind of stuff that fails, and then he has to be like, well, what's going on with us? Why does this fail? And what is the reality behind that is going to validate what we do? Because in some sense, any social structure you set up, if it's not aimed at the truth, is manipulative. It is. Any culture you set up is manipulative. Any educate, like, you can't teach people anything unless it's going towards the truth. Otherwise, it's manipulation. So Plato seemed to discover that as he was almost doing it, to find the good behind it.
Yeah, and I think the witness of Socrates is what sort of liberated him, because what is it that Socrates does? Socrates, in a way, he says the in order to actually do justice to what's highest, you have to relativize everything to it, and that means even your own life and your own aspirations and interests and so forth. All are relativized to this thing, and a life that bears witness to that might be said then to manifest absoluteness precisely in a relative way. I mean, so you get the paradox. It's you have a single individual that brings into the horizon somehow something that's greater than any single individual.
And that's because I remember you saying that Plato kind of sets up Socrates almost as an image of the good, like he's like a symbol that points towards the good in his life in that sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and again, precisely because, he says nothing that he does is any value to him unless it's somehow related to the good. So, I mean, you see that in the Apology, then you can see it, the evidence of this in the Symposium in a really powerful way. But it appears in a lot of his dialogues, and that's something like in our contemporary world when we have, the idea that the highest things are personal matters and therefore, sort of subject simply to private opinion. In a way, you can never get the light of the good in the cave. That's like sealing the horizon in a kind of an absolute way. It's really remarkable how that all works.
And how much we're in that at the moment, I think, is really the big problem. There seems to be almost like a developmental thing as well. I don't know if this makes sense, of like the journey out of the cave, that it's a journey from ego-centrism to bono-centrism. From the movement out of this just self-orientation where it's like, I'm man is the measure of all things, to the good is the measure of all things. Like that there's a super individual measure that you bear witness to, so you believe in it. I don't know, like you have to almost have this, like, how do you get a whole society or civilization to believe in that? Or do you? Like, I don't know how that even happened in the past. Like,
well, it seems to me this is why, the sense of what an authority was in traditional cultures was, in a way, someone who symbolically represents in his person something that transcends the, historical reality of the particular community. And on behalf of the community, I think that's a role that one has. But I want to just highlight the way you said egocentrism to bonocentrism. Typically, we would say egocentrism towards altruism, selfishness or altruism, and that's a problematic dualism that I think is a very, very common one. It's very different if you say not that you want to become other-centered rather than self-centered, but good-centered, because that actually affirms both the self and the other in the proper way, and that's a genuine transcendence. So I think that the way you phrase that is really crucial.
And it seems like that's what Socrates is trying to get them to do in the Republic, in a sense. Like Polemarchus and Thrasymachus and Cephalus and their kind of definitions that they give of justice in book one are very much initially just like, egocentric definitions. Like Cephalus wants to get away with his previous sins, Polemarchus likes war and business, and Thrasymachus is just like, I just want to be, run the show pretty much. So like they're locked into that frame, and Socrates isn't just trying to show them that they're wrong or something like that. He's trying to lead them to this higher understanding that seems to orient everything else. Like if you could just have that experience, the other things will fall in line.
Yeah, fall in line is exactly the point. It's not like you leave them behind. You can think of them as representing the three parts of the soul, the desiring part, the thumatic, spirited part, and then the head, cephalus, being in a way the reasoning part. But it's not like you have to choose any one of these parts. You actually, the soul itself is not the reference point, but the good is the reference point. And then when you see that, all the parts of the soul receive their due properly, which is why I think it's really important at the end, when Plato is comparing the philosopher king with the tyrant, as these two sort of opposites, which, if you recall, I mean, it's kind of interesting. He had set up the whole republic as a kind of a contest, and he was challenged, show me that the just man who is treated by everyone as unjust and tortured and imprisoned and even abandoned by God in a way is the best. And that's really what he does. And Socrates becomes the person, the sort of exemplar of this. But anyway, at the end, it's really interesting. Rather than saying you get rid of all of your sensual desires, he actually says that the just man experiences pleasure. I always get the number a bit off. Is it 728?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
I think it's
720 times, is it, or something?
It's 728, or is it 729? I think it's 728.
Like that, yeah.
He actually has a precise calculation. Which seems just hysterically funny and ridiculous.
Yeah, it's like the root of 3 times the root of 3 or something.
But the thing is, he's trying to show that there's a logic to it. And so, yeah. The just man actually enjoys sensual pleasures more than the one whose life is devoted to sensual pleasures. That's really a remarkable thing. So all of the parts find their fulfillment in the proper order. And, everything that happens within the horizon is receives justice, is properly affirmed in its place and so forth.
Yeah, we talked about that before in a sense that it's almost like the philosophical version of grace. You'd said that you need this superseding order to align the various parts to kind of stop their inner conflict but they can't do it for each other. It's not like one can be like, oh, this one. It has to be something outside of the system. And it really, when I was teaching it again, like Plato's, because I think he's trying to get this objective morality. He's trying to get to, a universal morality. And he really almost gives a biological account. I think you could prove this in terms of neurobiology. It was an argument I was making for the behavior of dopamine, because it's finite, but it's renewable. So if you use it in a way that's just like using it up all the time, like a hedonist would, you're going to be more miserable than a person who uses it modestly, because like that's the way and like Plato's almost spelling that out as it goes on. But it seems like it's like the opposite of addiction is this connection to reality in some sense. And Christianity, I suppose, it's idolatry.
Yeah, and the key is the transcendence. That notion is really crucial. It's got to be a principle that precisely is outside in the kind of radical sense, but the truly radical sense means it's always inside at the same time. If it's only outside, then it becomes relative to what's inside, and that's actually not transcendent. Something that again, this sounds so weird and paradoxical, but it really is rigorously logical that something can only be truly transcendent if it's also immanent. This was a theme that Eric Pearl, for me, was so helpful in making clear that transcendence implies immanence. But the point is that it has to be something that is radically other, or else you end up just relativizing things in relation to each other, and then it becomes a kind of a polemics, really.
Yes, which in our society, it's like the norm basically. It seems to be impossible to find coherence on anything, and Alistair McIntyre makes that argument in After Virtue that it's like, if you start from different assumptions, and obviously you don't have a first assumption like the good, it's actually impossible for you to reason or rationale to the same conclusions because you're starting from different premises.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't. So to go back to the cave analogy, I mean, in getting out of the cave, I'd kind of thought about that with the tripartite psyche, that he's almost describing the stages of the cave, that there's an organization of like turning away from the images is like overcoming the monster that finds pleasurable desires immediately. There's a necessary of courage to kind of go into the uncertain and the unknown and start to travel out of the cave. And then when you start to get knowledge of the forms, you're getting wisdom. Like the Plato's virtue ethics is almost tracking this transformation.
Yeah.
Which is aimed at obviously the good. But yeah, that there's almost steps on the way.
Yeah, no, that's nice. I hadn't thought of that before, but that actually works nicely. And it's interesting. The final step would then be prudence, or, phronesis, which does seem to be the virtue that he relates to this knowledge of the good as such, which is very different from our normal way of thinking of what prudence is. But that would then represent something of this sort of moment of transcendence. But the point that you said about grace is or the analogy with grace is really important, because it's not like one achieves insight by perfecting oneself.
Yeah, it's not like a maximizing, like
training one's own virtues or one's own skills and kind of getting there. There really has to be something that's genuinely other, to which one is responding. And
even the virtues in a sense are kind of like that. Do you think they're things that you follow, like that they're forms? They're not something you necessarily possess, but there's something ideal about them.
What was the first word that you said? That
they're not something you possess, or that you're trying to like maximize.
That you said even the something. I missed it. Even the
what was I saying? I'm not sure, but I guess what I was trying to say was that we don't necessarily possess the virtues in a sense that you would possess maybe like physical strength or something. You pursue them.
Yeah.
Like they're almost like that grace.
Yeah.
Like they're not something we own.
That's right. And here is something too, I think is helpful to see, because a lot of this, you think of the good as shining its light and so forth. It sounds like a very mystical experience that few people would have. But this brings us back to the point that you had made earlier about the real world. And I think it does connect also to this point about virtues. And that is, in a certain sense, this isn't some grand mystical thing, but it has to do with what's made available to us at every moment of every day. I mean, there's a sense in which, there's reality that's looking you in the face, and this reality is manifesting something from beyond and you're encountering it. It really is something other than yourself that you're encountering, and it's presenting something to you that is more than just you. And you can relate to that in different ways. You can think of it as something that you simply then relate to yourself. This is going to satisfy my project or my interest or my immediate desire. Or you relate to it as something that is coming to you from beyond yourself, and respond to it and see it as presenting a kind of goodness there that is more than you are. And you can, and in a very simple way, that just the immediate things, realities, natural realities. This is why a screen doesn't really do that.
I was thinking of the forest that you were talking about earlier. Like that experience of getting away from it, is now 10 times more likely to encounter that goodness.
Yeah, that's right. I mean,
if you saw it every day.
Wendell Berry, I don't know if you're familiar with him, an American sort of farmer.
I've heard his name before.
Essayist, poet, novelist, very, very interesting man. He has this poem, and it's something about the beauty or the peace of wild things, something like that. And it's a poem where he talks about this being in a state of distress and burdened by anxieties, and in some moments he'll go out to a pond or next to a stream and just lie down and listen. And there's something about that immediately creates a profound sense of calm. And if you think about what's going on there, I mean, he's allowing himself to encounter something really genuinely given, something that's absolutely not just a function of human interests. And there's something profoundly liberating about that. And that's a symbol, I think, of this journey that Plato describes in the Allegory. And it would be similar to, thinking of virtues not so much as skills that I possess, but as ideal excellences that I pursue, have that same sort of character of moving beyond one's own kind of restricted horizon into something greater. And that's really the crucial thing.
That seems to be the thing, that our restricted horizon has become kind of upgraded in a sense of that it can track what you're doing and personalize things to you and try and hook you in more and more into these feedback loops that ultimately feel terrible. But yeah, recovering a sense of that transcendence. And there was something I want to ask you about that was coming up again, which is the forms themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, because I think we've lost that obviously in the kind of empiricist worldview, which limits our access probably to, how do we argue that the forms are really real? That to people that don't, so many people hear that and they're just like floating objects in outer space or something, like,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing. I sometimes, when I, give a sort of crash course in Platonism, in my teaching, I'll use a series of examples. The standard ones about, chairs, everyone's sitting in chairs and they're all different, even if they look some relative sense the same, if these are mass produced chairs that the students are sitting in. There are going to be some physical differences, but you can also imagine, armchairs and thrones and so forth. We recognize. So, but the point is we call them all chairs. We use a single word. We don't say that they're chair-like or these are chairish sorts of things. We say chairs, and we have one single word, and we mean that same thing each time we say it. And what's interesting is that, what's going on there is we're actually meaning there's an identically one thing that is meant each time we recognize it. So what is that? And Plato would say, well, it's chair. It's chairness. And the fact that we can point to these different objects and use the same word means that it isn't simply in any one of them, but is something that is presented in each of these instances, but it transcends them. And there you see, you then can start to elaborate what that would mean, and would be something, another example I'll do is I'll draw some circles on a board and I'll just ask students what are these, and they say circles, right? And then I say, okay, well, wait a minute, are they? And of course, you can't draw a perfect circle, so they're all. And I said, but none of you hesitated for a second. You said, what is it you were looking at when you saw these as circles? There's something circle-ness. There was some ideal reality that you saw in a way in and through these things on the board. And then the question is, where is it? And they want to say, well, it's in our minds. And then you say, okay, wait, in your mind?
Nominalism.
Or in your mind? Or in your mind? Wait a minute. Or is it in all our minds at once? And if it's in all our minds at once, it means that it has to transcend our minds.
Yeah. Because I think that's a different reality.
Yeah.
Right?
And then you just say, okay,
different.
This is what Plato's talking about. But then you say, the caricature then is, these are floating up in outer space. But then, of course, you just say, wait a minute, are they in outer space? No, they are nowhere. and they're at no time, because that's precisely why, they're not physical things. Even floating in outer space it's a physical metaphor. So somehow these have absolutely nothing to do with time and space. They're completely outside. And when you start to see that, it actually, it's odd. In one way, that becomes more and more mystical sounding, but it becomes also more and more compelling as an observation of something we constantly experience all the time.
That we're constantly dealing with things outside of time and space.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It's very natural. Anytime you tell somebody that, sit in a chair, you're communing with the forms.
Yeah, and do you make a distinction between four? Because I thought it was like the example Plato uses in the Republic. Well, one of them, I suppose, particularly with the critique of images, is a bed.
Yeah.
And so, like, the bed maker has the ideal form of the bed, makes the bed out of it, but then a person who paints a bed creates a copy of a copy, and that's the lowest level of reality.
Yeah.
That would be the bottom one. But the form of it that the bed maker is using is the realist of them, in a sense.
Yeah,
that it's the cause of the actual or the physical bed.
Yeah.
That's right.
I think that's helpful. And what's the relationship then between the forms and their physical images and then their artistic images? It's interesting. He doesn't use this language in the Republic, but in the Phaedo, he uses the language of communion and presence. It's very interesting. Koinonia and parousia, communion and presence, and says that somehow beauty is present in beautiful things. And that's why we say each of these things is beautiful, because it's evoking something that is the same in all of them, but it's expressed differently in all of them. And then the question is, does this mean that Plato is, a dualist in the sense that he has contempt for images and so forth? And the answer is no. It's not that the images of, and this relates to the question that we were talking about at the very beginning. It's not that he gets rid of images. Images are good in their proper place. And I give an example to the students that, imagine the woman the man that she loves is off at sea, and she has a photograph of him, and every night she kisses the photograph. Is there anything wrong with that? And you would say no. And is she sort of obsessed with this piece of paper? You say no. She's in a way, she's kissing him in and through the photograph. This photograph is making him present too. And then the problem would arise if he sort of returns and she, holds the picture next to him and says, okay, I think I like this piece of paper better. It's much easier to deal with. That's where you run into problems. And then what happens there is there's no longer an image of him. It becomes a substitute.
And is that a kind of idol? Maybe? Yeah. Because we do that in our heads as well. Like sometimes you might have like an image of a person. You're like, oh, I love this image of them. But then their reality is kind of a pain in the ass. And you're like, why is this, but that, if you fall in love with the image of the person, you don't really love the person.
Yeah, that's right. And in a way you could say we're constantly beset by this temptation to settle down into our own perceptions of things and our, imaginations of things and the way we want them to be rather than the way that they are. So this is something, in a way that the example I gave is a, super simplistic one, but in every interaction, you might say, there's an image that we either focus on or see through to the reality, Jean-Luc Marion was interesting here. He makes a distinction between the idol and the icon. And it's really kind of a nice way of putting this point. The physical reality can be that in and through which we perceive what transcends it, or it can be where our gaze stops and then reflects always back on ourselves. And that's idolatrous and problematic.
Do you think this could be like the good internet and the bad internet? Like the good internet could be an icon
Yeah.
that, like, potentially like a conversation like this, if we're dramatizing, the ascent
Yeah. And
out of the cave, or
in a way, we're trying to point to some
we're trying
reality.
to,
Yeah. Jonathan Peugeot, I don't know if you are familiar with him, but
no, I'm a huge fan of Jonathan. Yeah.
He's really good about this point in saying, for the people because he has a lot of people that are inspired by him and watch his programs, and he's always reminding them, this isn't enough. If this doesn't get you to go to church, he says, then it's failing. And that's kind of what Plato is doing with the Republic in a way. He's saying, look, this book is not enough. If this doesn't get you to be, pursue the good in reality, burn it, throw it away. It's an obstacle, and that's, yeah. And it's interesting. I think it's, what is the proper way to keep the internet in its place? That is going to be an ongoing challenge, and we are at the beginning of the great epidemic. And this is going to be something that's going to take generations of reflection, and we're in for this is a kind of a cultural challenge I think the world has rarely seen.
I think Plato's Republic has a lot to offer on it as well, because to teach us on specifically this because we've kind of invented a world, and now there's a competition of businesses have hijacked it, but then there's people going, the government should run it, and you're like, well, there's other problems with the government running it.
That's right.
And it's like, well, who do you try and get a philosopher king that becomes the arbiter of the internet, and people want an AI one that's going to facilitate it? So
well, I think the thing is, there's no, to my mind, no obvious answer to the challenge yet. But at least one helpful thing is, consider the difference between, this is the Platonic judgment about writing. He doesn't reject writing, but he says it's a plaything that's best appreciated as a reminder for those who know. And you think about the internet, think about the relationships you have, that, let's say, with your family or friends that you communicate with through the internet, through social media. It's very different from maybe relationships that have been entirely mediated from start to finish. When the internet is sort of secondary and derivative of a relationship that has a reality that precedes it, there's a sense in which it's always going to have a kind of an anchor that allows it to be kept in its place. And when there is no real anchor like that, that's where real dangers start to emerge, I think.
Yeah, and I think COVID definitely did that, in a sense of that the digital overlapped the physical. That was really when I got interested in it, to be honest, was because I started to seeing one reality through social media of the friends and people I know, and then the other one that I knew was actually going on. And I was like, this is like a funhouse mirror of absurd, like, this is crazy. Like, this is like, if I was to take on face value what people are posting and saying, I'd think everybody had lost their minds. Like, they'd all like, right. But then I was talking to people, and you'd meet with people, and it was perfectly normal. And you're like, there's some disconnection between these things here.
Isn't it amazing? Just like the Wendell Berry experience, just a good, solid encounter with the real. And so many of these anxieties and these confusions and these complexities, they just melt away like magic. It's really something. A good, and you and I, before, I think it was before you started recording, we're chatting about like Iris Murdoch, who she evokes the experience of hearing a songbird in the beauty, catching a glimpse of something real and beautiful. How that can just immediately free you and relieve your conscience and kind of open you up. And that's, to me, that itself is a sign of the priority of reality, that we're meant for what's real, and that just a glimpse of it can be so immediately refreshing. That's a good word for it. You feel,
And that some people don't get that. I mean, it's such an interesting, like, why would you be so? Because, like, I totally agree with you. I think that that's the fundamental reality, is the good, the true, and the beautiful. And yet there's so much cynicism, so much nihilism, so much, like, essentially a kind of belief that reality even, like, is an evil kind of thing, or like that it has to be this horrible, difficult, like whatever is the worst thing is the most real, in a sense. And you're like, you know, it's such a strange, I don't know, trap or something, that you can become so disconnected from
well,
for
I think
years. Yeah.
that's the thing. I think if this becomes kind of the screen in a way becomes habitual, then it does suddenly you're able to entertain the strangest ideas, like all of existence might just be a video game that we're, I mean, that, and those kinds
Simulation
of
and
things are just, how in the world could you even think of that as a possibility unless you were so um alienated from yourself already that you can't really see the difference. And that's the thing. We are going to, the whole COVID crisis. There were people that were entering in, young people entering into their most important developmental stages right at that moment where they were no longer allowed to look at the face of human beings. Um, and this we're going to be discovering in a decade or so how devastating all that was. Um, yeah, it's
yeah,
bad.
there's a yeah, and it really is, and it's such a hard thing, I suppose, because I'm doing like internet ethics or whatever you call it, but like it really just pales in the face of this civilization level transformation, and then also the lack of kind of institutions behind it that would have been normal. Like, so it kind of connects to the meaning crisis and to people leaving behind, structures of family and structures of religion and structures of any normal kind of things that
Community. Yeah,
um community, and get hoovered up very easily by this persuasive machine.
yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, and it's pretty compelling. How does as my wife will often say, you think about the quiet attraction of a natural landscape. I mean, how can that compete with the demand for your attention that the screen, with its noise and bright lights and kind of, just movement. It just seems like it just gets overwhelmed. Reality can get so easily overwhelmed. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the good news is, in the long run, that it probably doesn't work. You know what I mean? Like, it is a kind of drugification of reality, and
Yeah.
people will probably have to get sober at some point and
Yeah.
stop,
Yeah. Yeah.
inhaling information like a stimulant.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
we haven't really touched on this, but, don't want to open up a whole new subject at the end here, but, I get so worried about Chat GPT and artificial
Yeah.
intelligence and my kids, I've two kids in high school now, and one of them, and we have, they say, far too extreme restrictions on their screen use, but we keep telling them that they'll thank us for it in the long run. But but we're not absolutists. They do, they don't have smartphones. I actually don't. My family, we don't have
It's a
smartphones.
genius move, to be honest, based on all my research anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, it comes with certain disadvantages, obviously, but we're sticking to it as far as we can. But anyway, the temptation to use ChatGPT to write up, you have to write a report on some artist. It's almost overwhelming. And my son said, well, what about just having a draft and then I can put it in my own words? And, I just say, look, you have no idea how easily that would become habitual in a way that would deprive you. You would never really learn how to think something through and write about it. It's like having a machine lift weights for you. What would be
Yeah.
the point?
Go to the gym
Yeah,
and
sure. Just
the
have,
machine gets buff.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
what would be the point? It would be a total waste of time. You need to
I
do
know,
it.
and it's such a I've been involved in a bunch of projects in the university in with generative AI and academic integrity, and we're doing loads because the university hasn't released any like protocol or like say
Yeah,
you can't do it, or there's this real hands-off approach, and then there's some people are like, oh, we need to just get them using it and integrate it, and it's going to be conscious and super intelligent and we'll all be using it, and you're like, are we in a like technopoly where it's
yeah,
just
right.
like whatever comes along just has to become integrated into things? It's like this is antithetical to education. Like you can't,
Yeah,
it
and
does
you
the
wonder,
job for you.
can't we ask, is this good for us? And are we free to say no if it isn't? And, those kinds of things just don't seem to be on the horizon. But that in itself is just such a you know, evidence, just a powerful piece of evidence for the problem.
Which is the underlying problem I think we've been talking about, which is this lack of a foothold in a solid, actual state of ground where you can make those judgments of good and bad and right and wrong and, actually kind of deal with them.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just, fine, we're being manipulated by one technology or another technology. Like,
Yeah.
how
Yeah. And
can
unless
you
you have that
even call it?
foothold, you're never going to be, in fact, free ever.
I don't want to be too much of a downer ending, but I suppose
Yeah.
the positive side is that it is accessible and
Yeah.
it is there. And yeah, I've been profoundly transformed by my study of Plato, I think, in that sense. And as I was talking about, obviously I'm getting baptized and now going to mass and exploring, Catholicism, and that has been such a source of beauty and joy and connecting to people, and like, hopefully that's emblematic of something other young people will start to look for, because the digital world becomes so toxic, like
Yeah. And that's a
we can't
foothold.
live in it.
And that is something that is not measured by what's going on, in the immediate, just Twitter landscape, as they say, even though Twitter, I guess, doesn't exist anymore. It really is it's a foothold in what transcends all of this. And that's what we all really want, actually.
Yeah, that's what is it. Our hearts are restless till they rest,
Mhm.
and you, Augustine, our hearts are restless on the internet anyway. Hopefully it could be an icon maybe, but
Yeah.
at best that gives something to aim for. I think even for people like me who are creating things online and putting stuff up, like we should be aiming for icon, not idol,
Yeah. That's nice.
is a pretty good mantra. Um, yeah. So thank you so much, David. Really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
And I appreciate it too. And it's nice to see you again and look forward to the next one. But in the meantime, all the best to you.